Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Disinformation Chronicle. I want to talk about this story I just wrote. I was spurred to write this when a big bolus of emails just came out, and I saw my name in some of them. And it was about an article I'd written back in 2021, and it was these scientists complaining about me for basically exposing them. And I thought it'd be fun just to go back and take a look at what was happening and what they were complaining about. So early on in the pandemic, when it starts in 2020, there was this definitely an attempt to people were being labeled conspiracy theorists for speculating on the possibility that the pandemic could have started in a lab. This is one of the things that made me realize that the media was covering everything very poorly because we had no clue how the pandemic started. It could have been a lab. It could not have been. No one really knew what was going on, but there was definitely a campaign. And I picked up on it pretty early in 2021 when there's a little bit more opening to talk about this. The BMJ hired me to write an investigation about this. And it was about the fact that the media was victim to a virologist's conspiracy to label everyone conspiracy theorists. And we knew this at the time because by 2021, a bunch of emails had come out showing this orchestration by virologists to plant studies. And they planted a study in February in the Lancet. They put another one out in this journal called Emerging Microbes and Infections, and then one in a journal called Nature Medicine. And all of these articles were orchestrated behind the scenes, the emails show, and they were planted to label people conspiracy theorists for speculating on the possibility the pandemic could have started, in a lab. And the reason why they were worried about that is because that was their colleagues in Wuhan that they had been working with. And this involved their research as virologists. And so they were terrified of the possibility that someone might think that virologists started the pandemic that virologists were trying to stop. And here was one passage out of that story that I wrote for the BMJ back in 2021 on this conspiracy to label critics as conspiracy theorists. And I pointed out that a leader in this campaign has been Peter Daszak, president of EcoHealth Alliance, a nonprofit organization given millions of dollars in grants by the U.S. federal government to research viruses for pandemic preparedness. Over the years, EcoHealth Alliance has subcontracted out its federally supported research to various scientists and groups, including around $600,000 to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Surprise, this is where people were worried that the pandemic may have started. Shortly after the pandemic began, Daszak effectively silenced debate over the possibility of a lab leak with a February 2020 statement in The Lancet. We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin, said this letter. And it was signed by Daszak and 27 other scientists. Many of those scientists, by the way, they lied about who they were. They actually were affiliated with EcoHealth Alliance, but they used academic affiliations instead. That letter, by the way, in The Lancet is widely discredited now. Peter Daszak's conflict of interest statement stretches on longer than a Russian novel. And Nicholas Wade, who's a long-term science writer, he described this entire conspiracy theory label as it's a label you pin on something you don't agree with. And that's essentially what it was. It was just a label that was being used to shut people up. Another person involved in this was a woman named Laura Helmuth. At the time, she was editor-in-chief of Scientific American. After the former CDC director, Robert Redfield, was on CNN, and he said that based upon what he had seen, he was a guy with a top secret security clearance. He was a virologist. He thought that the pandemic started in a lab from all the evidence that he had seen. And she went off attacking him on Twitter at the time. She said on CNN, the former CDC director, Robert Redfield, shared the conspiracy theory that the virus came from the Wuhan lab. And then the following day, she had her deputy, he wrote a hit piece on Robert Redfield, weighing in on something he doesn't really understand. Yeah, also, this reporter at Nature, Amy Maxman, she labeled the idea the virus could have started in a lab as just conjecture. She doesn't know anything either. This is purely political, what was going on at the time. So what these new emails show is that after my piece came out, it really riled up a bunch of people at the NIH and a bunch of their virologists they were funding. And some of the people involved were there were the two NIH employees, Greg Folkers and David Morens. They were two guys working for Tony Fauci, who, of course, was most concerned about this. Morens forwarded my investigation to Peter Daszak. This is the guy we spoke about, EcoHealth Alliance, and Gerald Koish. He's a Boston University professor and a close collaborator of Daszak. And after they, you can see that from the subject that the subject is my article in the BMJ from the title. And Daszak emails the groups that I was a shyster. And he's really disappointed they gave the space to this shyster. And I've been trolling people on the dark web. I don't even know what that even means, the dark web. It's just so funny. They were obviously just angry at, what I'd said. And then Koish responds, he says, do any of you know has become of Peter Smith, a former editor of the BMJ? So what they were doing is what typically happens in this area, what happened throughout the whole pandemic. They were plotting behind the scenes to try and destroy the reputations of people. This is what they're doing. They're plotting, like, how can we get to the editors of the BMJ to discredit Paul Thacker? And you can see that what Peter Daszak responds is like, I think this is a really good move. And then he describes a bunch of things that he said that I had written that he thought were wrong. All of these things that I wrote, by the way, were true. The Daszak essentially silenced debate. That's true. Everyone agrees upon this. People closed ranks. They all began marching behind Daszak. All that's true. And then he says what I wrote was pretty offensive stuff and regurgitated of earlier crap that I'd written on the web. So he just was very upset that this piece appeared in the BMJ, and they're like, how can we get to Paul Thacker? By the way, I have no clue if they contacted the BMJ. Scientists did contact the BMJ about me. This is a very common tactic. We've seen this popping up in emails to try to discredit someone behind the scenes. So I just want to talk about what happened to all these people, like, since this time, right? So this is 2021. Well, where are we at today with all these people who were orchestrating all this stuff and trying to attack people like me behind the scenes? And Laura Helmuth making crazy claims people are conspiracy theorists when, they're actually experts with top secret security clearances and virologists like Robert Redfield. So in late 2024, the House investigators, they released a memo. They were internal documents, and they found that Morens had engaged in serious misconduct, potentially illegal actions while serving as a senior advisor to Dr. Fauci during the COVID pandemic. And when he was called to testify before the House, his behavior is so egregious that even a Democrat called him a stain on the legacy of the NIH. Days before the Biden exited the White House, they waited till the last minute to do this. His administration formally debarred Peter Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance from receiving any federal funds, and they did this to protect the federal government's business interests. Well, Daszak is now suing EcoHealth Alliance, and he started a brand new nonprofit that he calls Natural Health Global. The address, I looked it up, the address for this, when you look for it on Google Maps, it goes to a post office box in upstate New York. And if you go to the website, you see that now one of his employees is now David Morens. So the guy that he was working with to try and rig things inside the NIH, David Morens has now had to leave because his behavior was illegal, what he was doing internally inside the NIH. He's now gone to work for Peter Daszak. So they've all found each other again. And then shortly after Americans elected Donald Trump to president, Laura Helmuth, very unhinged woman. She used to be my editor. I've worked for her before in the past. Incredibly unhinged. She sent out this tirade on Blue Sky. I captured it. I was just so appalled at it. I captured it and just threw it up on Twitter. I'm like, okay, this is like how crazy the editor-in-chief is of Scientific American. And her behavior was so egregious. She called the voters who put Trump in office fucking fascists. She made all these other crazy claims. Scientific American had finally had enough, and, they fired her. So we've seen that some of this crazy behavior, there's been some accountability before it. They no longer can use this conspiracy theory label to just try and denigrate people's professional status. But to this day, we still really haven't had accountability for what happened with this pandemic, something that killed millions of people. It's been the worst hit to the economy since the Great Depression. None of these people have been held accountable for their behavior. There's more emails out there. They're going to be coming, and there might be some accountability. I don't feel positive, but at least we'll get some closure on this. I want to thank you so much for coming back here. If you could, please go down the bottom and hit the subscribe. Keep coming back, guys. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you.